Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Life After Deconstruction podcast. My name is Anthony Miller, and today I'm deeply grateful to be able to share with you the talk that I gave on February 25th, 2023 at the Thrive St. George Conference. It was a fantastic weekend with multiple speakers, more than 300 people in attendance, some very tender and moving conversations and presentations. The title of my talk, Life After Deconstruction. I hope you enjoy it.
Now, I named my podcast and I named my talk. I don't know if we can dim the lights a little bit so that we can see the slides a little bit better. Life After Deconstruction. And what I've experienced is that there's a lot of material and resources out there for the deconstruction process, to unpack meaning, to go through our stories, to put in the grief work and so forth. But I want to have more conversations about what life looks like after deconstruction. And we saw some of those amazing things today. But what I don't want is I don't want to prescribe to you, or I don't want other people to prescribe to you what that looks like. Instead, I want to take you by the hand and have you join me in discussions and exploration of what that can look like, and then you get to decide for yourself what that looks like. And those things are interesting to me. Now, if you're in the beginning of a faith transition and you're processing the grief and the trauma, maybe this is a hint of what might happen in the future, but this is what I'm talking about, is what happens after you've processed the trauma and the grief of faith crisis. Now, as she mentioned, last year I shared my 6-hour Mormon story in less than 18 minutes. There were a couple people that have watched this. Who's watched this? Okay. All right. If you haven't seen it, I relived the trauma of my faith crisis on the stage. And you can find it easily just by Googling Anthony Miller TEDx talk. And as I prepared for my TED talk, I wanted to talk about the things that were significant to me, like I experienced suicidal ideation during my dark night of the soul. I experienced disassociation. I experienced extreme experiences of trauma. I confused experiences of love, peace, joy, and connection as if they were God telling me something was objectively and literally true, because that's what I was taught. And so I wrote a TED Talk explaining that. And I shared that with, after having rehearsed it, not really being satisfied with it, I shared it with one of my friends, and he said, "Anthony, this is bullshit, man." We're allowed to cuss here, I understand. So he said, what you need to do is you need to take people by the hand and you need to walk them through what that is. And you need to do it in a way so that it's more universal than Mormonism. And you need to do it in a way so that believers can understand what we experienced. And so that's what I did. I led people through the experience. I rehearsed it about 100 times in the weeks before I gave my TED Talk. And the morning of, I rehearsed it in the shower and I broke down crying. And I was so afraid that I would break down crying so bad during my talk that I couldn't express what I had prepared. But I was able to do it somehow. And it's made a big difference in my life to have been able to do that. After my TED Talk, I was very concerned I would have a vulnerability hangover. There was one speaker after me, and then there was a break, and then I went out, and this woman came up, and she wrapped her arms around me. I really should have brought a box of Kleenexes. And through tears, she said, "I was brought up in a very strict Baptist congregation." Oh, thank you very much. I was brought up in a very strict Baptist congregation, and I was in an abusive marriage with a husband that beat me up all the time. And I eventually gained the courage to leave him. But in our congregation, divorce is forbidden except for adultery. So I was excised from my church. And my parents and family are part of the church. And that is what crushed my shelves. And I'm in the dark night of the soul. And I feel seen. And the second person was a 16, 17-year-old girl. And she came up to me and she told me, I've watched your Mormon Stories interview. I'm in the dark night of the soul. My parents think that it's Satan that's causing this. They've forbidden me from accessing the internet. And I feel seen in my experience. And I can tell you that there was no vulnerability hangover after. Because if it was only for one of those people, it was worthwhile doing. So in any event, maybe I'll cry less if I talk about what happens after. So in my TED Talk, what I explained is, well, what I explained was, I walked people through, I'll explain it now. As human beings, we have experiences in our life, and we attribute meanings to those things, like symbols. And over time, what happens is we enmesh those meanings with our identity. And I use this metaphor as the meanings that I attributed to these transcendent experiences, the experiences of love, peace, joy, of connection, of feeling like I had answers to prayer, of a community that gave me roles, reputation, and an opportunity to make a difference in the world. And I attributed meanings to these things as if metaphorical vines that intertwined around my heart. And over time, they grew into my heart, and eventually they became one with my heart. One of those experiences was when I was serving a mission. I was a perfectionist. It was toward the end of my mission, and I was worried that my mission was a worthy offering to God. And I was really concerned about this. So I fasted and I prayed for several days, pleading in prayer for an answer. Then one night, I found myself sitting on a couch in a small, humble apartment living room of a family we had recently baptized. And the wife of the family, when it was time to leave, the wife of the family stopped us and said, I feel like I need to share something with you. And she brought me her journal and opened it to the day of her baptism. And she shared about her experience of that day, about feeling the Spirit in the Sunday school class, and feeling the Spirit when she was baptized, and feeling the Spirit when she was confirmed a member. And as I read it, I felt a softening in my heart, and tears began to fall down my cheeks. And I felt like I received a sacred answer from God in those moments. Almost as audible words came to me. That for me, I don't know if this is for you, but for me, the purpose of this life is to live with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others. Full stop. And that whether or not my mission was an acceptable offering was the wrong question, because that actually was an egocentric question about me and not about God and others. And those kinds of experiences became additional vines and layers of meaning around my heart and became one with my heart. So then what happened along the way, of course, when I gave my TED Talk, I didn't have it bowed that heavy. Because I'm so analytical, I came across countless things that caused significant dissonance for me, things that I couldn't reconcile about church history, about scriptures, things that leaders said that violated my conscience, things that I couldn't reconcile with what I understood about science and history. But because the meanings that I attributed to my spiritual experiences were so strong and so much a part of my identity, it gave me strength to set those things aside in faith that God would give me further light and knowledge about them someday. But my shelf was massive and sagging and heavy laden. But because I attributed these meanings, because I had this community, because I had this identity, because the way I knew and attributed meaning to God was so enmeshed in my identity, I was able to prevent my shelf from collapsing. So then one day, the dark night of the soul, one of those extras. When I was 49 years old, the year that we would become empty nesters and I would turn 50, I would serve as an ordnance worker with my wife. I was seeding a Spanish branch for our stake in our ward. Everything was just going super well. I mean, I was close enough that I could have retired then. And our 22-year-old son came out to us as gay. And I could not shelf the implications of that. I knew in my heart the God that I knew wouldn't want my son to live a life painfully absent the kinds of comprehensive love that my wife and I share. I mean, our marriage is like a lot of others, and there were times that we didn't do great, and it was painful. And to think that my God would want my son to live a life with that absence, I couldn't shelf it. So I went online searching for resources as to how a believer could support a gay son, and I stumbled across the gospel topics essays. Things that I had always been led to believe were anti-Mormon lies. But they were just history. And as I consumed the essays, I recognized, particularly in the race and the priesthood essay, that in history, the brethren didn't have the capacity to discern between their own biases and prejudices and actual inspiration from God. And surely they had spiritual experiences that confirmed the truthfulness of the now disavowed doctrines that they taught. And as I read those things, I recognized that my spiritual experiences had been something other than a reliable divine witness of truth. And when I recognized that, because that's the way that I knew God, and it crumbled on me. And God ceased to exist in those very moments, notwithstanding my cries out to him in prayer. It felt like, there's the imagery of the rabbit hole. I was sitting on our bed with my iPad, and it felt like the room was spinning. And what I share in my TED Talk is that in those moments, all those intertwined vines and layers of meaning around my heart, all these treasured experiences, all my roles, my reputation, my family connections, how I made sense of life, my ego, everything in those moments were abruptly and violently ripped from me. Thus the shredded heart. So what is the dark night of the soul? I mean, it's different for other people, but mine was acute. God left the corner of the room where I knew him. I was immediately in existential faith and identity crisis, and for the next 6 weeks, I cried myself to sleep most nights. I spent hours and hours each day consuming information to try to make sense of what I had discovered. I counseled with my bishop. He gave me a blessing. He had no answers. He's like, well, maybe I can help you. He's like, I understand there are the essays. I couldn't find anyone in my ward that had read the essays. He's like, what's an example of something that you had a problem with in the essays? So I thought, well, I'll share something innocuous with him. Did you know that the 1890 manifesto was essentially a fraud? That Wilford Woodruff actually added another wife after that? And then there was another manifesto in 1904 that lied about what the leaders of the church did? Did you know that? He's like, well, yeah, I'm a descendant of one of those. I'm like, what? How could I not know this? Like, I went to BYU religion classes, I studied things, but I stayed in the mainstream of the church. I taught gospel doctrine. You wouldn't be surprised if I read a lot, because that's how I'm built, right? So the biggest thing is grief. So I want to talk a little bit about grief. So some people think that when grief happens, it consumes the entity or the jar of what you are. I mean, that's what I experienced. I was full of grief, crying myself to sleep, trying to make sense of things. I even asked my wife, am I even the same person I was a couple weeks ago? Because I didn't recognize myself, right? And some people think the way that the grief work works, or the process of processing grief, is that you do work and then it shrinks over time and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. But that's not how grief works. This is how grief works. It stays the same size. And the grief work is to expand the being that you are. That's what grief work is. And you can't bypass this. You can't say, oh, I'll just do this later. It takes work. And sometimes it's traumatic. And sometimes the most powerful thing is for someone to sit with you, to listen to your story with full validation and acceptance and understanding it, and just not being alone. In psychology, this is called active listening. The act of actively listening and holding space for another person while they tell their story of trauma and grief is significant to the process of healing from trauma and grief. That's why there are grief groups for like kids who lost a parent, or that's why AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, has power, because people who go to a group meeting, they know that even if they really screwed up, I didn't say a cuss word that time, if they really screwed up, but you can imagine what I would have said, that the people there in the group, they're going to hold space for you, and they're going to love you regardless of how much you screwed up. And that's the power of community. That's the power of the kinds of conversations that are happening this weekend. That's the power of support groups, particularly in smaller settings. That's the power of one person sitting with one person and listening to their story. Now, there's something that happens as this stays the same size, but your being expands, and that is that your grief can become a superpower, because at any given time, you can access that to have empathy and hold space for another person. And that's powerful, and it makes a difference. And that's one of the main reasons, not only for your own healing, that you need to do grief work, that you need to put in the work to get through these things, is because that you can pay it forward and make a difference in other people's lives. Now, my friend Randy Bell, he's right over there, super tall. Actually, I'm short, but he's tall too. He wrote a book about post-traumatic thriving, and he gave a talk in a Thrive meeting that I spoke at in Southern California. And one of the things that he says is it's to overcome trauma, it's critical to deconstruct. And what I want to do is, for a little bit, talk about deconstruction. Now, deconstruction is an academic term that was used in the past to talk about how do we look at the symbol of language, how do we look at the symbols of polished dominant narratives, of stories, of myths, and things like that. How do we go deeper to unpack what those meanings really are? Like someone could say, I believe in God, and you could say, what meaning do you attribute to God? Is it Book of Mormon God that's a great spirit? Is it lectures on faith God where Jesus is a physically resurrected person and God is a body of spirit and the Holy Ghost is their combined mind? Is it King Follett Discourse God? Is it Brigham Young's God? Is it Joseph Fielding Smith's God? Is it I would say that the God of President Nelson is different than the God of President Uchtdorf. So I'm not saying that you need to unpack God, but actually you kind of do. But deconstruction is the work to uncover meaning, to figure out what things meant, to figure out what you're going to do with it. Sometimes when we talk about deconstruction, we are referring to just a process of destroying and dismantling everything. And certainly there's some of that needs to happen. But the process of deconstruction that makes the biggest difference is the work that you do to uncover the meaning of the experiences that you had so that you can do something with it, so that you can make grief a superpower. Now, The Naked Pastor is pretty amazing, and I'll have to pay for this if I try to monetize it, which I won't. But how hard you believed is directly related to how hard you can deconstruct, because there's more unpacking of meaning that needs to happen. So I had a hell of a lot of things to do. All right. So what do you deconstruct if you're in a faith crisis, if you're in existential crisis? History, scriptures, spiritual experiences, myths. By myths, I mean connecting stories and narratives, fictions, imaginations that we put together so that we can be a country. Like the border between the US and Canada, it's an imaginary thing. Like it's not a real thing. Currency, the $10 bill that you used to buy a t-shirt, like that's just a fiction that we attribute meaning to so that we can function on a greater whole of society. And there are major myths that are important. Religious myths, like what sports team do you like? Like why does it matter if you root for your high school football team? Like there's all sorts of things. Community, what does community mean? Roles, reputation, family connections. When you go through a faith crisis that's an acute existential faith and identity crisis, everything gets renegotiated. Because you were married based on constructs that have crumbled. And so you have to put in work to deconstruct what your marriage is. Why are you choosing to continue to be married now? And sometimes the faith crisis reveals a marriage that has a level of dysfunction where it needs to end. And sometimes it reveals a marriage where people can no longer delay the work to the next life, where they're going to put in the work now, and the marriage gets better than it ever was before, and everything in between. And it takes a long time sometimes. So we deconstruct what morality means, what grief is, what trauma is, what boundaries are. As Mormons, we're terrible with boundaries. Like where in anybody's comprehension would it be okay that a bishop could, or a home teacher or a visiting teacher could show up at 5:30 on a weeknight for a drop-in visit to a family that has kids and they're trying to make dinner without any advance? Like, that's screwed up. I would have said the F-bomb on that one too. So where do we go to deconstruct? I bought a lot of stuff on Amazon, at Audible and Kindle books and podcasts and YouTube and Sunstone and Church History Association. Like I wanted to make sure that I was getting good information. So I asked around, how do I figure out if something's good information? Well, if the book has been nominated for an award with the Mormon History Association, it's probably a scholarly thing that has some credibility. So that's the kind of thing you did. So let's talk about 4 different things to deconstruct. Now, backroom professor, could you stand up? Where is he? Oh, yeah. Oh, so this is going to be a little bit heady stuff, but I tested it out and I talked with him about it last night, and he understood it. So if he can understand it, you got it made. You're going to be fine. So I'm going to talk about 4 things. So one thing to deconstruct is collective myths. It's this thing that I was talking about, fictions, right? So collective myths, if you read the book Sapiens, it's that we have the capacity to believe in things existing purely in imagination. And all large-scale cooperation systems owe their emergence to our cognitive capacity for shared fictions and symbols. So it's important to me to understand, where did religion come from? Where did my belief system come? Where did these narratives come from? Like, this is more than just trying to figure out, where in the hell did someone make up a story that Washington cut down a cherry tree? Like that, what was that for, right? But this is going deeper into trying to understand what happened to me and why did I apply critical thinking in all areas of my life except for my faith. And so that's part of deconstruction. The next thing is to deconstruct is spiritual experiences, because that was so enmeshed in my identity. So I'll just mention a few things that I deconstructed. So elevation emotion. So elevation emotion is a phenomena that happens probably from our biological evolution. That when we participate in, perceive, or ponder with gratitude the mercy of God. No, when we perceive actions of remarkable moral goodness, there's something that happens to us where there's a release of dopamine in our system. And we feel a warmth and swelling in our heart. And our charitable disposition increases, and we're more cooperative with others. Like maybe Paul would call it love, peace, joy, right? So elevation emotion serves a very important purpose for humanity. But sometimes religions co-opt that and say, that's God telling you something is objectively true. Those experiences were real, right? Now, that doesn't mean elevation emotion is a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing. We survived as humanity because of it, because we needed to not always be warlike. We needed to care about our community and protect our tribe, our family, our nation. We needed to do those things, and when we do those things, we perceive moral goodness and we have these experiences, right? So another part of spiritual experiences is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is we don't have the physical capacity to see outside of our bias. We talked about this last night at our table, where some of the women said, I could not see the patriarchy when I was in the church, and now it's amazing of what I can see that I'm outside of it, right? The women express that. I mean, men, we really have a lot of shifting to do. Another example that I share with confirmation bias, as far as not being able to see things or fully recognize things, is all of you have experienced this. If you've never driven a Subaru, and then you buy one and start driving it, you all of a sudden notice them everywhere, right? That's how your brain works. So if you go back and read the Book of Mormon now, you're going to see things that you did not see. You're going to like, this is so one-dimensional, like God wants to like burn freaking everybody and kill them, or like bless them, like so binary, right? And you didn't see that before, right? Because of your confirmation bias. We have the illusory truth effect, where is the testimony is gained in the bearing of it. Actually, that's true too. If you repeat something over and over and over again, you begin to believe it. Like Brian Tracy in sales training says, before you go into a sales interview, say, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself. By the time you go in, like you're so in love with yourself that people love to be around you because you're exuding confidence, right? Because we believe what we tell ourselves over and over again. Now, there's something else that happens to us, and I can't explain it. Because I almost heard words that said the purpose of my life is to live with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others, and I have no idea where that came from. It didn't come from a bearded polygamous man out in the universe on a planet that's crystallized near a star called Kolob, okay? But it came from somewhere. And sometimes we have those transcendent connecting experiences. And they're full of grace. And they're beautiful. And in my TED Talk, I decoupled my transcendent experiences, my elevation emotion experiences. I decoupled all of them, but at the end of my TED Talk, I honored every single one of those things, decoupled. And there's value to that. So a big part of the work is to figure out spirituality, to figure out spiritual experiences. And like Alan said earlier this morning, even as a self-identifying atheist, he seeks to find spirituality in his life. Now, the next thing that we need to deconstruct is moral frameworks, right? So what are moral frameworks? I think that moral frameworks are based on an emergence of our internal moral intuitions and our preferences, our cultural conditioning, what we're taught, what we see in our community, our social evolution, and there are biological factors to it, right? So a big criticism of, now Backyard Professor had a little bit of hard time with this one, but he got it in the end, so. Yeah. So the criticism of the apologist and the religionist is that people who don't believe in objective morality dictated from God can't be moral because their moral framework is fungible, right? It can't be objective because it changes and it's just based on what people's intuitions and preferences are, right? That's what they say. You can't be a moral person. There's no meaning to anything. Nihilism, just go, end your life kind of thing. But moral frameworks are important. And part of the deconstruction process is to figure out what is your moral framework. Not because it was dictated to you, not because it was a bunch of puzzle pieces that were prescribed to you that you had to put on your table, but you're going to pick up one piece at a time and go, okay, my intuition, my preference tells me that integrity, honesty, and transparency is a core moral value. And get curious, where did that come from? That's something that I want to keep, right? Loyalty and obedience based on what? All those different things. Now there's different resources. Jonathan Haidt talks about those things. And I want to talk more about this moral frameworks with regard to religious constructs. I'm going to talk about 3 different models related to religious ideas or theology. A top-down, a bottom-up, and a universal model. So the top-down model is this idea that's common in literalist religion. And that is God's up here, we're down below. God chooses men, for some reason, not women, but men, and communicates his objective morality and will and desire through men on earth. And then those men tell us what to do, right? Sometimes the men are like sock puppets, like God is like narrating every single word. Or sometimes if there's like a tremendous amount of nuance, if there can be in fundamentalist literalist faith traditions, it's that God communicates through impressions to these men, and these men then use their cognitive abilities and language that they have at their availability to then express to us what God wanted. That's top down. That's what Mormonism is, right? So the next model is what Pete Enns refers to as what Scripture really is. Pete Enns is a biblical scholar. It's the bottom-up model. In the bottom-up model, as human beings, we experience elevation, emotion, connection, love, peace, joy, grace, transcendent experiences. And we want to attribute meaning to those things. We create our own myths, or we adopt the myths of others. And in the bottom-up model, what we do is we experience these things, and then we attribute those things to God. And then what writers do is write scriptures of what they think God would like them to write, as if God was actually literally speaking to them. And many biblical scholars explain that that actually is what scriptures are. Because there's no consistent theology of what God is. There's no consistent atonement theology. There's no consistent creation narrative. It's all contradictory, right? Joseph Smith was contradictory over his time. We have current general authorities that can give 2 different conference talks, and they're contradictory to their own selves, right? So that's the bottom-up model. The third model is the universal model. Richard Dawkins calls this sexed-up atheism. And it is pretty sexy. And that is, as human beings, Alan Mount referred to this earlier today, as human beings, we experience moments of transcendent connection and grace that move us as if we're part of a greater whole. Like we're part of a greater organism. Maybe Eckhart Tolle says that we're parts of the universe having a temporary conscious experience. And then as human beings, then, we gather from that, and through moral intuition and preferences and culture and biology and social experience, we develop a moral framework, right? So the religionists say that that's all fungible, so it's not objective, and it doesn't mean anything, and it's fake. But the truth of the matter is, theirs is no different, because theirs is inconsistent, contradictory, and so forth. So it's hypocritical for them to say that, because when they say objective morality comes from God, none of them can agree what God is. Is there an infinite regression of gods, or is Blake Ostler right? Like, what is God even, right? All right. Got it, backyard, Professor? Okay, we're good. All right, so what are scriptures? I loved the scriptures. I felt and experienced elevation emotion, transcendent connection, grace through scriptures. They're beautiful stories. The story of the woman taken in adultery is powerful. You know, the parable of the sheep and the goats, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to give drink to the thirsty, to shelter the stranger, to visit the sick and the imprisoned. And that is what qualifies you to be part of the kingdom of heaven. Like, those are beautiful things in there. What are scriptures? I had to figure it out. What I learned from biblical scholars is that just like if Dallin Oaks gives a talk today, he's expressing his current theological, political, philosophical, and rhetorical goals and concerns today. And if 500 years from now somebody reads one of Dallin Oaks' talks and perceives that it has some sort of connection to them, they have a propensity to proof text that talk and say that was a direct prophecy about the future. But it never was. It was Dallin Oaks expressing his concerns about today. And what biblical scholars will tell you is that this is what Scripture is. When you read the Scriptures, what they are is the writer or the redactor expressing the concerns of their day, right? And Isaiah wasn't talking about Jesus, right? Ezekiel wasn't talking about the Book of Mormon, right? Although sometimes in scriptures there is prophecy that's true. And you know why it's true? It's backdated prophecy. It's written after the fact, right? That's how we know when the book of Daniel was written, right? Because it was written around 167 BCE about things that had already happened. And the writer wrote it as if it were a direct prophecy, and it was so super accurate. And the reason that we know when it was written is because the prophecies start being wrong. Kind of like a book that gives all these prophecies about the New World and America and Columbus and everything like that, right up to the 19th century. And then the prophecy that the Gentiles that are righteous are going to unite with the Lamanites and overthrow all the wicked, like slaughter all the wicked Gentiles. That never happened for some reason, right? That's how we know when that book was written. When the backdated prophecies that were accurate stop, right? Now, this can make Scripture very interesting if you're like nerded out on stuff like that, like me or Backyard Professor, a couple other people, because then all of a sudden Scripture becomes really interesting. Like you read Deutero-Isaiah, and it's about what they were dealing with in the exile. You read the book of Job as it's a metaphor for Israel, trying to make sense of what happened to them. You read the book of Jonah, and it's a satirical allegory pushing back on other Hebrew narratives, saying that God could give a shit, I can say shit, about non-covenant people, and that Jonah was pissed that because he knew if he went and taught the non-covenant people that God would forgive them. Like, that's kind of interesting. If the person who wrote that, that's what they were, I shouldn't use Dallin H. Oaks, but like, it's a Dallin H. Oaks talk, but good, you know, like with a good lesson. So there's some beauty in that. I just went too far, okay. I didn't say Dallin Hoax, okay, so. All right. So there's a process, and it's important to go through the work, and it takes time, and it's okay that it takes time. You don't have to listen to podcasts like 12 hours a day, you know. You can just take your time and put in the work and realize that the joy is in the journey. The moments of divine or whatever God moments, whatever meaning you want to. Alan Mount talks about it as the spiritual moment, as someone who identifies as atheist. Those moments are in the journey. Those moments are in letting go of the dominant narratives and putting in the work to uncover what the meanings of things are, and then you get to decide for yourself what it is. Now, for me, it's a combination of things. It's to honor that answer that I felt like I received on my mission. That the purpose of my life is to live with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others. And for me, it's to strive to manifest the fruits of love, peace, joy, connection, grace in my life. Because when my believing friends and family are around me and they feel what they perceive as the Spirit, then that heals those relationships, right? I mean, there was a time that my countenance changed, for sure. I was pissed. I experienced anger and depression. I spoke with emotionally charged language. And the narrative was that my countenance changed because of Satan, right? I was under Satan's power. That was just grief. It wasn't Satan. By the way, Satan didn't exist as a single individual until the Greco-Roman period, so Dan McCullen did a class on this. Satan didn't exist when Nephi is placed in time, as a single individual. So they're concerned about the change of countenance. They're concerned about testing behavioral boundaries. Certainly, I tested behavioral boundaries with booze when I was processing grief. And sometimes that was maybe not helpful, right? But the work after the deconstruction, the work after processing the grief and trauma, I think, if there was something, like I say you need to choose for yourself, but like if there's going to be one that I recommended to you, it's to strive to manifest these fruits in your life. Because it will help you. It'll give you those moments of transcendent connection that Alan and Katie talked about. It'll give you those moments of transcendent connection like I experienced after my TED Talk. And those people came up to me and they felt seen because I was willing to bare my soul. That's what I think you should do. Thank you.